Hello, my name is Mark Dietrich. I am the chair of the board of the Alliance for the American Rule of Law, AAROL, which is a not-for-profit organization made up of lawyers and judges and others who have worked to promote the rule of law overseas, who are now a little bit concerned about what we are seeing in the United States as regards to the erosion of the rule of law in this country. This is one of a series of interviews that we're conducting with rule of law experts and colleagues of ours who have worked overseas, who have been willing to share their experiences overseas and to share their thoughts about what they are seeing in the United States. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ted Jonas, who is an American lawyer who has lived in Georgia since 1994, both working on democratic promotion programs and as a practicing attorney. Ted is an AAROL supporter and has already submitted a very great blog piece that I recommend that you read. And we're going to talk to Ted today about his experiences in Georgia. Ted, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
I'd like
Glad
to
be here.
start by asking you just to tell us a little bit more about how your international career started and how you first came to go to Georgia back in 1994. What were your motivations and what led you to do that?
Yeah, thank you. I had actually always been interested in international affairs in the world growing up. And by the time I came to Georgia in 1994, had already had 10 years experience after college, 4 years on Capitol Hill. Then I had gone to law school and went back to Cornell University for law school for 3 years. And I clerked for a federal judge. And then I was in private law practice. And I was in private law practice in my hometown, Atlanta, where I'm speaking to you from right now. And I found that it was a lot more boring than the years I had worked in politics and the time I had clerked for a federal judge. And I wanted to do something international. So I really just kind of hit the eject button on being a bankruptcy and commercial litigation lawyer in Atlanta in the early 90s with some very fine firms and started to look for international work. And NDI, the National Democratic Institute, was an organization I knew because many people I had worked with on the Hill were working for NDI. So I did have kind of a foot in the door there. And the fact that I got sent to Georgia was pretty random. In fact, they were about to send me to Latvia. I was classified as a parliamentary expert because I'd worked on the Hill. They were about to send me to Latvia, and then they suddenly said, "Would you be interested in Georgia?" And I said, "Yeah, Georgia has mountains. That's more interesting." And also my boss at NDI said, Latvia, it's going to be in the EU, it's going to be in NATO, but Georgia is a real hard case. And Georgia at the time was in the aftermath of civil conflicts and ethnic conflicts. It was very chaotic and violent still when I got there in 1994. So it was a bigger challenge and it was more exciting. And it was quite a change from practicing law in a tall building in Atlanta.
Tell us a little bit more about what you found in terms of the rule of law and the justice system and the parliamentary system there in Georgia when you first arrived.
Sure. It was There really was no functioning legal system. There was a functioning parliament. It was the parliament that had been elected under a provisional, not even a constitution. It was just called a law and state authority after the coup in 1992. So it was actually a provisional parliament. And they were under a mandate that they'd set themselves to adopt a constitution by November 1995 and to hold new elections for permanent executive and parliamentary authorities. The parliament had the elections in 92, which happened right at the beginning of the Abkhazia War before I had come, had been very democratic. So there was like 40 parties represented in parliament. It had been like a ranked proportional system. So the parliament was chaotic. There was a lot of screaming, people throwing things at each other, but it basically functioned, and Shevardnadze had a bare majority. And in that first year that I was there, 94 to 95, Shevardnadze succeeded in rounding up and disarming all of the paramilitary gangs like the Mechedrioni and the Guardia that were besieging society. And then by 96, I got to really do what I had come there for. I mean, in 95, I worked on the elections and on the adoption of the Constitution. In 96, a new parliament was seated, and it made amazing progress between about 96 and 1999 in adopting new legislation, post-Soviet legislation. They adopted a German-based civil code. They adopted a number of German-based laws based on the advice of the German government and party organizations. The Americans and the Germans in the 90s were in kind of a competition, actually, for importing or exporting laws into the Georgian legal system. So there were also a number of laws, if I remember correctly, a lot of financial laws that were based on U.S. laws. And the system actually functioned quite well in the 90s. There was also a judicial reform under Misha Saakashvili, who at that point was the chairman of the Judicial Committee in the parliament in the 90s, where they replaced all the old corrupt Soviet judges. So in the 90s, they made a lot of progress, but then they started to backslide as Shevardnadze couldn't control the domestic corruption. And about 98 or 99, things started to kind of go into reverse. And then I always say I've been in Georgia for 30 years, but in fact, it's -5 because I then in 2000 to 2005, I came back to the States and worked at Baker Botts in Washington, D.C., did a lot of international oil and gas, bankruptcy, things that I knew about for 5 years. And then I went back to Georgia in 2005, which was after the Rose Revolution. I went there to open the DLA Piper office there. And it was amazing how the Saakashvili government, really threw all of that corruption into reverse and replaced the corrupt police. I mean, there was an enormous cleanup of retail level corruption. They had other problems, the Saakashvili government, but and this Georgian system, the Georgian distribution of power between the executive and the parliament has never actually been as democratic as it was in the late 90s.
Yeah,
That's
that
another
was
story
a
that we can get into now.
no. I was just going to say that was a period of great hope for Georgia, and when you look at the context of the former Soviet states, Georgia was really the standout in positive terms in terms of combating corruption, modernizing the judiciary, and there are a number of programs and projects through USAID, and some of which I worked on to help support Georgia in that process. But then things fell apart. What happened?
Well, things fell apart, I would say, almost 3 times. It's Georgian democracy and governance and everything. It's been kind of like this, so it fell apart in 92 with the civil wars and the Abkhazia war. Shevardnadze pulls it together in 95, 96, seats a parliament. You have 3 or 4 years of a highly functioning government, a lot of optimism, a lot of incoming foreign investment, a lot of economic growth. But then with the ruble crash in 98, other economic pressures, and Shevardnadze's inability to clean up corruption. He was good at international relations. He was good at democracy. He was a real Democrat. And he allowed opposition in the parliament, and it was quite a give and take and checks and balance kind of system. But then it goes into this decline because of corruption and because of his kind of aging, a bit of dementia, things like that. So, which leads to the Rose Revolution in 03, 04. And then with the Rose Revolution, what you have is tough, strong government comes in, arrests all of these corrupt players from both the private sector and from the government. They literally fired all the police and went through a testing and rehiring process. They did another judicial reform. They do a lot of great things. And there was a huge consensus in the society. And not to mention, by the way, providing electricity and water and heat, which was 3 things that Shevardnadze could not do, and one of the things that really led to his overthrow. And so the Saakashvili government successfully builds up a state that provides government services, modern government services, e-government, very little corruption, infrastructure, construction, the building of roads, the improvement of roads, maximizing the amount of IFI money coming in. There's all this great stuff happening. But they had a real, Saakashvili's one of Saakashvili's models was Ataturk. And he kind of had that mentality of, to borrow from another authoritarian, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. That was kind of his approach. And they got increasingly authoritarian and kind of closed to the outside, and they were responsible for a lot of human rights abuses. They had call it aggressive law enforcement is a misnomer, because they were making up crimes to prosecute people on and extort them. So by 2012, that government, because of its human rights abuses and its clannishness and also corruption, returned, but it was all this kind of high level corruption and extortion. um, the public turned against them, and there was a free and fair election in 2012 that elected the Georgian Dream Party under Bidzin Ivanishvili, which promised that it would back off on the society, on business, and take the boot off the neck. And they did. I mean, there's a lot of people from the opposition and Saakashvili supporters who will say, "Oh, you should have understood what Bidzina was from the beginning." And of course, Bidzina was suspicious and mysterious and weird from the beginning. But the truth was that they were elected fairly. The UNM, Saakashvili's government, to their credit, left office and allowed the transition of power, a democratic transition of power. But the Georgian dream became increasingly dominated by uh, part of their original campaign rhetoric, which is essentially Christian nationalism and the right wing view of sort of blood, soil, religion, and state that you see coming out of Russia and out of Hungary. They started to adopt that increasingly, but they continued on the path of EU accession, signing all the agreements, NATO accession, joint exercises. Some of the most impressive Western integration in terms of institutional integration happened on their watch. But then the more moderates in the government, people I think you know personally, but the more moderate players in the government, Irakli Alasani, Atina Filashvili, Datu Supashvili, they left the government because it was becoming increasingly anti-Western. That happens around 2015, 2016. And amazingly, they maintained the pro EU and NATO stance as they got more repressive, but nonetheless, they maintained the pro EU and NATO stance as they got more repressive up until 2024, which was the really radical break when Bidzina makes a speech. And this is what led to the demonstration where I got beat up. Was Bidzina made this speech where he called the West essentially an enemy in the global war party. He made a rare public speech to a rally. And then they were also enacting the Russian foreign agents law. And that's what we were out there protesting against, actually, at the time I got beat up. And those huge demonstrations, 200,000 people, 100,000 people were coming out into the streets in Georgia against a Russian law. And what has happened since then has been far, far worse in terms of more draconian laws, people being beaten up, all the opposition politicians being arrested. So it's amazing how the Georgian public has stepped up again and again to defend democracy and to do it in numbers that you won't see in other countries. And we were talking about this. It's amazing that people that now, nearly 2 years after these heavy demonstrations started, and the heaviest repression has been rolled out, and so many people are in jail, and everything is illegal. Practically talking to somebody about politics is illegal now in Georgia. You still are getting 10,000 people out on a Saturday night, even though there's not immediate prospects of an end to this.
Before we get to the protests and what happened to you, um, just put it in a little bit of what happened in Georgia. If you could put that in a little bit of a global context in terms of during Saakashvili's time, there was also war with Russia, and then subsequently the war in Ukraine, the full-scale war in Ukraine, erupted. So if you could just talk about that a little bit, and then also if you could tell us specifically what you referred to and many others refer to as the Russian law. What did that do? If you could address those two questions.
Okay. So the 2008 war, and I should have mentioned that actually, is definitely one of the things that undermined Misha Saakashvili. That war, essentially, and there's much debate and argument over how the war started and who fired the first shot and all of that. But the bottom line is Putin was ready in 2008 to draw Misha into a trap, and everybody was watching this. And at first, it looked like it was going to be Abkhazia. The war came very close to breaking out in May 2008 in Abkhazia. There were actually exchanges of fire and from both sides, but it calmed down. And the U.S. Embassy under George W. Bush, despite rumors to the contrary, was actually really trying to avoid the war. Anyway, if you ask me, Misha stepped into a trap in South Ossetia in August 2008, a trap that was laid for him by Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin wanted that war, and they created a situation where they were attacking Georgians, and the Georgians responded. The war, perhaps a cooler head than Misha Saakashvili would not have stepped into that trap. I think that's one thing that people blame him for, is that he was too impulsive, and he should have held back. Another thing is that the Georgians didn't, in some ways, they did execute the war well. There were certainly a lot of heroes who were killed in that war on the Georgian side, about 1,000 people. But the military did not do as good a job as it should have done, in various ways. More territory was lost. More people were displaced. What had already happened in the early 90s with Abkhazia and South Ossetia was replayed with what little territory Georgia had managed to hold on into those places. So there was a lot of anger and disappointment about Saakashvili. And it was a huge setback to the country's progress. It drove away foreign investment. It also coincided with the global market crash in the fall of 2008. And actually, ironically, it's probably too much detail, but ironically, the Western aid package to Georgia after the 2008 war actually cushioned the effect of the global financial crisis on Georgia a bit. But nonetheless, the war was one of the things that hurt Saakashvili, and that was a lesson to Georgians. A lot of Georgians took it as a lesson. We can't stand up to Russia. We can't have a war with Russia. We are a tiny country. They're a huge country. Their army is far bigger than ours, no matter how good our army is. We can never stand up against them in a war. As for Ukraine, if you look at the Ukraine events as something starting, or restarting in 2014 with Maidan and with the initial Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine, the Georgian government generally kept a sort of sympathetic pro-Ukraine line. You remember the as much as people criticize Barack Obama on Russia and for not doing enough on Russia, and I share that criticism. He was actually the person who pushed the Europeans and pushed the world into imposing sanctions on Russia in 2014. And Obama had not been happy about Saakashvili. That happened under George W. Bush's watch, but Obama, the U.S. diplomatic view of Georgia after the 2008 war was that Saakashvili was somewhat untrustworthy, and so there was I think that they had an open mind about the Georgian dream. So you don't really see the Georgian dream the Georgian government start sticking a knife in the Ukrainians' back until the major invasion in February 2022. My impression is that it scared the hell out of them. They thought the Georgian dream government, or Kotsebi, as we call them in Georgian. I know from business I was working on at that time that they were terrified that Russia was going to invade Georgia in February 2022, and they did everything they could to appease Russia. And I think a lot of their actions after February 2022, in terms of backing off from the EU and the repressive laws and the alignment with Russia, came out of their anticipatory fear of what Russia could do, as well as what Russia was communicating to them. It also has very weird origins in a completely unrelated thing, which is that Bidzina Ivanishvili had about $1 billion in various financial instruments, deposits, and insurance trusts with the Swiss bank, Credit Suisse, and it was ripped off by a Credit Suisse banker. There's a Credit Suisse banker who ripped him off of several $100 million. And he won, Bidzina, all of his court cases to get that money back. But then Credit Suisse wouldn't return the money on the grounds that he was an unreliable or bad reputation tied up with Russia and all of that. So although there were no official sanctions on Bidzina at the time, Credit Suisse would not disburse the money that the courts had said he was entitled to. And he turned this into a whole conspiracy theory about the West being against him. That's where the Global War Party, and they're trying to coerce me into supporting NATO, to supporting the Ukrainians, and they want me to open a second front. Now, it's completely insane that Credit Suisse and Switzerland would be involved in a NATO plot to involve Georgia in the war in Ukraine, because as we all know, the Swiss are neutral and they care about their banks. I mean, this was the last thing that the Swiss would do. But it was absolutely in his head. And he's, for example, in the speech on Rustaveli in April 2024 that led to the huge demonstration where I got beat up, he was, ranting about that. So this is kind of the weird thing. Georgia has this very peculiar dictator. So it's not only global events and geopolitical trends that affect it, because they do, but it's also his mishigas, his craziness, and the things that he latches onto. As far as the Russian law, that was only the Russian law they adopted in the spring of 2024 was only the first step. It was the Russian foreign agents law. It's very onerous to apply. It requires an enormous amount of record keeping and a very major government role. And true to form, they were incompetent to actually administer their own law. They had problems administering it themselves. A lot of people weren't complying. So then they said, well, you know what? We're going to and they were being criticized by the West. We're going to prove to you that you're no better than us. And they rescinded the Russian law and they adopted U.S. FARA. Now, I've actually been myself registered 2 or 3 times in my career as a lawyer under U.S. FARA when the law firms I was working for or employers were foreigners or doing work for foreign governments.
And FARA,
They
just
adopted
for our
U.S. FARA
viewers, Ted, just for our viewers who may not know what FARA is, could you just spell that out?
Foreign Agents Registration Act. And the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act was adopted in the late 1930s because there were a bunch of Nazi lobbyists, not even Soviet Union, although that became an issue as well. But in the late 30s, the Nazis had hired a bunch of lobbying firms in D.C. to lobby the Congress. A lot of things don't change much. This was late 1930s, and Congress passed the Foreign Agents Registration Act to make it clear which of these law firms and lobbyists were working for the Nazis, so they could know that. This was in 1937 or 38 when the law was adopted. And the law over the years, just a small digression on the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act, had never been used except in connection with an investigation into something else. So if somebody was bribing a politician or a member of Congress, or somebody was money laundering, and they were also doing some kind of lobbying of Congress or the administration while they were also engaged in some other criminal act, illegal oil trading, sanctions busting. The Justice Department used to have a very helpful list of the 17 FARA case prosecutions they had brought since the 1930s. The Georgians adopted it, of course, and foreign agents, not to get too legal, but the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, is based on our old Anglo-American common law principle of agent and principal, okay? Doesn't matter if you receive money from a foreign government. You have to be acting for them as an agent. You're a lawyer. You know what a principal-agent relationship is. It's literally like a power of attorney. I act on their behalf, not in my interests. People receiving grants, organizations, TI or East-West Management Institution or Transparency International or the Georgian Young Lawyers Association, they are not agents of USAID or their donors. They say, this is what we want to do, and they get it funded, and they do what they want to do. But the Georgians, being from a civil law system and not having this background of principal agent, they see the simple receipt of money as establishing an agency relationship, even when it's a grant. So they adopted U.S. FARA, which is also hard to apply. But in fact, these foreign agents laws have only been part of the picture. What they've also been doing is amending the grants law so that any grant to a Georgian organization, now individual transfers even to individuals by a foreign organization, has to be approved by the government. And all of the major European donors have pulled back and stopped donating. The German government, the German ambassador Peter Fischer said the other day that Germany halted $370 million. Georgia is a tiny country of 4.5 million people or 3.8 million people. $370 million is a lot of money. They have stopped disbursing money because of the grant approval process. And then now what's going on was that because the NGOs are finding ways to get around those prohibitions on foreign funding by getting donations from individuals, by raising money locally, they're outlawing that. They're basically outlawing donations locally. They're outlawing certain speech. They have gone to an extreme. They've gone to the kind of Belarus or Russian or Azerbaijani kind of extreme about, any kind of civil rights or democratic free speech. And I guess the last thing I want to mention, because you mentioned the wars, yes, it is true that the Georgian public's fear of war and the success of the Georgian Dream's propaganda about the danger of war with Russia has been very successful with them. And one of the failures of the Georgian political opposition has been their failure to accept that people have that fear. It's a rational fear in Georgia, and that they need to be able to explain how Georgia can get closer to Europe without provoking an attack by Russia. I believe that is true. I believe it can be explained. I think that Moldova is a very good example of it right now, and Moldova is an even more. I think Moldova is, if you could point to one country whose situation is even more precarious than Georgia's in its versus Russia, it's Moldova. So I think it can be done, but they have to talk to people. So that's the fear of war, the 2008 war, the Ukraine war, are things that the Georgian Dream uses in its propaganda to not even get loyalty from people. Will say, "I hate the Georgian Dream," but the other guys are going to get us in a war, and that's an opinion you'll hear there.
It is amazing to me to see what happened in Georgia and the ups and downs that it endured in terms of its democratic and rule of law progression. It's just extraordinary the number of people that turned out on the streets to protest against the Russian law and these other laws that have been enacted since. And
the stolen elections, we haven't mentioned that the elections in October 2024 were fraudulent and stolen, and that revived, in fact, the protest movement. And Kobachidze, the prime minister, saying that Georgia was not going to pursue EU candidate status. That actually re-sparked the negotiations in the fall of, the demonstrations in the fall of 2024. And they're still going on.
You participated personally in the protests. At this point, you were a joint Georgian U.S. citizen. What drove you to take to the streets, and tell us what happened?
I've always been kind of a civic activist. I mean, when I worked on Capitol Hill in the 1980s, I used to participate in marches and demonstrations in Washington, D.C. In Georgia, I did not participate in any protest movements or political movements until I became a citizen, which I think was in 2017 or 2018. I had a view of Georgia that, there had always been challenges to democracy and rule of law in Georgia from the time I got there in 94. I mean, it was non-existent in 94. But under Shevardnadze, under Saakashvili, especially under Saakashvili, there were major challenges to rule of law. And I always fought against those behind closed doors because I wasn't a Georgian citizen. I was a practicing lawyer with clients. I didn't want to alienate the government. But I was on the board of AmCham, and I was often State Department officials under the W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration. I was the person that they would talk to. So I always sort of advocated for holding the line on Georgia's democracy and on Georgia's rule of law. Once I became a citizen and I sort of went part-time as a law firm lawyer and was no longer it was no longer like everything I did would reflect on the law firm because I became enough counsel. I was part-time. I took a lower profile role on purpose so I could be more involved in social and environmental things in Georgia. I came out for pretty much any demonstration. I came out for many of them in 2019, 2020 that were protesting undemocratic actions by the Georgian government. So this was routine for me, actually, to come out to just, and I felt that it mattered because the Georgia that I had grown up in was a Georgia where when people protested, Shevardnadze reacted. Saakashvili, reacted, sometimes violently, but they cared. They cared about protests. They cared about what the West thought. They cared about their human rights image, even if they had problems with it. And when I started coming out for the demonstrations in the spring of 2024, those were the most aggressive, some of the most aggressive demonstrations one had ever seen in Georgia, in the sense that people were shooting fireworks at the parliament and people were really sort of pushing the edge with the cops, remaining nonviolent themselves. I mean, but it was very tough. And when I was shouting names at the cops and calling them slaves and Russians and traitors, and a group of them ran at me from 30 or 40 yards away and attacked me, I was like, wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen. They're not supposed to come out and grab me because I was yelling at them. I didn't physically confront them or anything like that. And so it was an interesting, I had an understanding that one could peacefully protest in Georgia, and that understanding was, I was disabused of that understanding in April, May 2024 when I was grabbed and beaten up. But I've always been a person who believes that we must stand up for our rights and our democracy when they're under attack. I'm sitting here in Atlanta right now. I was in Atlanta for the first No Kings March last April. And I do the same thing here. In fact, I feel like it's even more important to do it here in the United States now.
Before we get to the United States, what happened to you? What was your experience? You were beaten, you were arrested, you were detained, charges were levied against you. What was your experience with the police and the justice system in Georgia at that moment?
A sham. It's a total sham. You had police special forces. You have three types of cops out there at these big demonstrations. Okay. The worst ones are these guys. They're not wearing any body armor. They're not wearing insignia. They just wear black suits and masks and like black clothes and masks. People call them special forces or spetsnazmi. They kind of overshade into something we call titushkebi, which is like thugs that don't even work for the cops, but get hired on a contract basis to beat up demonstrators. Then there were the robo-cops. Those are the guys with the face mask and the shields and the like football pads and all of that, who are the ones who actually fight against the massive demonstrators. The black suited guys run out and grab people from the crowd and beat them up. That's their major thing. And then the regular cops, the ones in uniform who have badges and are supposed to be accountable, they're not. They're in the back. And so I was grabbed by the black suited guys. I was thrown into an unmarked van by the black suited guy. I was beaten up by the black suited guys badly. It was like 3 rounds of beating over several minutes. I was dragged across pavement. I had a bloody nose. I had a black eye and it messed up my vision for 6 months. I had a crown knocked off a tooth here, which I just got replaced a couple of days ago. I had a big injury on an elbow. I was really quite beaten up. And I was in the custody of the black suited guys for a good 2 hours in this unmarked van after, bleeding and everything like that. And more people kept getting added in there. They would open up the doors and randomly beat people up while we were in there. And then the word got out because I had managed to hold on to my phone when they stuffed me in the van, even though they had asked for it. I said I lost it and they didn't check. So I had it. So after a couple of hours, there were people all over the world, literally, who were aware that I was in this van and beaten up. U.S. State Department people, who I knew, Georgian journalists and activists in law and human rights stuff. So the message got through to the cops, I guess, from somewhere that there was this American, even though I never once said I was an American. I said I'm a Georgian citizen. I speak Georgian. I use Georgian with him entirely. Of course, I could tell I'm a foreigner, but nonetheless, I use Georgian. And I said I'm a Georgian citizen. I never pulled the American string with them, but I did on the phone. So I get pulled out after a couple of hours. Where's the American, in the van? And I was handed over to the regular police, the ones in the regular uniforms, who stuffed me in a little Skoda with four big guys. And I was sick and I was throwing up from all the gas and from being beaten and the head injury. I had a concussion. Um, and I was taken to a police station, processed over a period of a couple of hours, filled out documents. I can read Georgian, so I could see what I was signing. I knew what I was signing. Um, and uh, and then released at about 5 o'clock in the morning. I then was scheduled for trial. I was charged with petty hooliganism and disobeying the lawful orders of the police. And I was really sort of proud to be charged with petty hooliganism because growing up, I'm 63. I grew up in the Cold War. And I remember that all the Soviet dissidents were always charged with anti-Soviet hooliganism. So I really felt like I was in touch with history being charged in Tbilisi with, as an American veteran of the Cold War, with petty hooliganism. Uh, we used all of our legal rights. I used all of my legal rights at my trial on these two administrative offenses. I was defended by Sandro Batamidze, who's a former deputy justice minister, who's a great guy, extremely knowledgeable constitutional and criminal lawyer who works for Transparency International, an experienced guy. And I think we had 7 or 8 hearings because I insisted on all my procedural rights, that they had to notify us of evidence in advance and all that. The judge, I think, was more careful in my trial than in the usual Georgian trial to give me my rights. She would not normally, I think, in a typical Georgian trial, for example, have adjourned the hearings to give us notice of evidence and things like that. So she was kind of careful about some of those procedural moves. But on anything in substance, she was ridiculous. I couldn't say anything about my injuries because that was irrelevant. I'd been charged with a crime. The only question was whether I was guilty of the crime. We had proof that the police were lying and that they had even falsified. They had changed with whiteout a document that I had signed. They had changed the time of my arrest because I had my phone, which had all the metadata on it, the time and date stamped pictures, recordings, messages, all that kind of stuff. So we were able to completely undermine their whole narrative top to bottom. They said that they said that the guys in regular uniform, who, as I said, I didn't see until 2 hours after I was beaten up and held in the van, that the guys in the regular uniforms had themselves personally come out and warned me to stop saying mean things to the police and that I had refused. Okay, no, that's ridiculous. I mean, those people were nowhere near there. And the prosecutor introduced a video of me being attacked by this group of Titruskebi special forces guy who run at me from a far distance. I mean, their own evidence showed the regular cops were nowhere near. I was beaten up by these guys who were not identified, who were not in the court. And she just overlooked all of that. And we said, look, and then I gave a closing statement where I said, this is perjury. It's a criminal law violation, and you're just allowing it to happen in your court. Aren't you ashamed, that you would allow these crimes to be committed in your court? So the process was just ridiculous, and this is not just Ted Jonas. There's hundreds and hundreds, literally, I'm not exaggerating, well over 1,000 by now, cases of the same thing. The pattern by which they grabbed me, kidnapped me. The only thing that was different about my case from the typical Georgian was I didn't get held for 48 hours. They usually hold people for 48 hours. I was released that night. I wasn't held for more than about 6 hours. So I got the break as the American guy or the American dual citizen for sure. But there are hundreds of cases, so they pursue all these cases the same way. The prosecution videos are the same. The teachers, the special forces guys come out, they grab somebody from in the crowd, they beat the hell out of them, they hold them for 2 days, they convict them of petty hooliganism and disobeying the lawful orders of the police. There's hundreds of cases like that. And some of the people are beaten up like I was. Some of the people are even beaten up even worse. And some of the people are, actually there were people in the van who had probably out of the 11 people in the van, there were probably 5 or 6 who hadn't been beaten. They'd managed to not be beaten, but the rest of us were quite beat up. And um, so, I forgot what I was saying. The train of thought about. We'll have to edit that out.
Let me just jump in to say I'm so sorry that you went through.
Oh, about the lying and the process. Yeah.
No,
yeah. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, so one thing you can say, sir, about the numbers of people who've been beaten, and then there have been longer term political prisoners, opposition politicians who've been arrested. Um, One thing you can say for sure is that our courts are functioning far better in the United States than they are in Georgia. And in fact, our courts, I think, have been really impressive, federal district courts and state courts.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I was going to say I was so sorry to hear the story from you now, kind of in person. I've heard it before or read about it, but I'm sorry to hear that you went through all of this. I'm also sorry to hear that, we spent, and I spent a fair amount of time working on judicial reform issues in Georgia, and that when push came to shove, no pun intended, in Georgia, the judiciary did not stand up. What do you think went wrong in Georgia, and what threats to the judiciary in this country do you see that are of concern?
So I think the fundamental difference is that there is not a history and culture of judicial independence in Georgia the way there is in the United States or in the Anglo-American, in the common law tradition. And I think it's notable that the judiciary has been a bulwark against executive authoritarian action in countries that have a common law background. And so, for example, in South Africa under apartheid, uh, there were actually some significant court decisions against the South African government. Despite that system, there was still some degree of independence in the courts. You see the same thing in Israel today. They're under great pressure from the executive authorities, and the Israeli courts and law enforcement apparatus have held on to an amazing amount of independence. And you could say this about some of the UK, Canada, Australia, United States. So our judges in the United States have a really federal district judges, and it's obviously the vast majority of them have a very strong sense of their duty and responsibility and the independence of their role. And you can see it in that judges who've been appointed by Republicans, by even Trump himself, hold on to that. Unfortunately, we see that less as we go up the ladder. It looks like, the circuit courts of appeal, the appellate judges and the Supreme Court feel like they come in with political mandates or something. I don't know, much more so, I think, than the district judges. In Georgia, it's interesting. Under Shevardnadze, with Saakashvili leading it in the late 90s, ABA Sealy, the rule of law program, was responsible for it. They did tests and replaced the entire cohort of judges that were hangovers from the Soviet period. And they raised their salaries to $500 a month, which in the late 90s was quite significant. Those judges eventually became corrupt and became politically responsive. Saakashvili carries out another judicial reform, replaces those people. The Georgian Dreams judges today are the ones inherited from Saakashvili's government. One of the things that's notable is that the most captive puppets in the judiciary of law enforcement, the ones who were most carried out state orders under Saakashvili, are the same people under the Georgian Dream government. So why is this? I think that the answer is, and it was particularly obvious with this reform that happened under Shevardnadze, if the police and the prosecutor aren't reformed, then the courts won't hold up, because the police and the prosecutors and the prosecution has really never been reformed, but the police and the prosecutors Ministry of Interior has never been reformed under any Georgia administration. They will threaten, they will hold, this is your job, they will keep. So I think Georgian judges have a tendency, and we've seen it really under three separate administrations, Shevardnadze, Saakashvili, and the Georgian Dream. They have a tendency, when faced with counter pressure and when faced with threats, to fall into the state administrative apparatus. And the historical role of judges in the Soviet Union was essentially as administrative agents of the state. And they see themselves in that role, and they see themselves as doing what they're supposed to do when they're in that role. So the judge in my case, a young woman, 30 years old, and many of them are notable for being relatively young, they feel like nothing bad can happen to them and no negative consequences can happen to them if they do what they're told to do by the prosecutor, by the police, even if they know that it's not the judicial standards that probably you guys and other people train them in, ignoring perjury, ignoring rules of evidence. There have been a couple of amazing examples of Georgian judges in the last year, a few months, who've actually stood up to the machine. You may have even read about it. One guy in Tetritskhado, which is a rural town, has released demonstrators and actually just now tried to bring a case in the constitutional court to invalidate some of these laws that have been passed under the Constitution, and they kicked his case out. They said, "You don't understand your role as a judge. You're not allowed to be a plaintiff in a case like this." So I think that there's just still a fundamental problem of lack of reform in the Ministry of Interior, the security services, and the prosecutor's office. And you will not get an independent judiciary until those agencies start to act according to the law. In my opinion, the best thing that could be done is to put non-political professionals in charge of all of those positions: Minister of Interior, Prosecutor General, head of the State Security Service. I could even name names. I mean, but essentially people from the civic sector who are not partisan. It's funny how the Georgian Dream attacks Transparency International or the Georgian Young Lawyers Association, one of these people, as being plants for the UNM, because in the UNM days, they were all attacked as being Russian agents, you know? So that shows you that Eka Gigori at TI or Nino Lomjadia or Gaila, they're doing something right because they were as attacked by the UNM government for their efforts as they have been by the Georgian Dream government. A lot of them are the same people. In my opinion, some of those people should be appointed to positions like Prosecutor General and Minister of Interior and Minister of State Security.
Well,
They know how to do it.
hopefully the story is not over in Georgia just yet. It's I know things are pretty grim there and difficult for our colleagues in civil society and people who are working to promote democracy and rule of law there. I want to turn more to the U.S. now and ask you to compare and contrast your experiences in Georgia with what you are seeing in the United States, and tell us about your thoughts vis-a-vis what we are seeing in the United States right now.
So ideologically, I think MAGA and the Georgian Dream are actually quite well aligned ideologically. They are quite similar. It is the same, as I said before, as what you see with Viktor Orban, what you see with Vladimir Putin, what you see to some extent with Benjamin Netanyahu, different religion, but similar tendency, or even Erdogan, which is a guy with blood and soil and religion. And so there is a lot of ideological alignment, in fact, going on there. And the global war party, deep state, they use the same kind of rhetoric. Their enemies are liberalism. Their enemies are individual rights, gay rights, for example. So there's a lot of ideological alignment. the Georgian dream is so insulting towards the United States and even towards the Trump administration that they have managed to alienate the Trump administration, despite the fact that they are quite ideologically aligned. I think it's when I compare, as I did in the blog, certain things about rule of law in the two places. As I've already said, our courts are something we can really be proud of, and that's a real bulwark against authoritarianism that doesn't exist in Georgia. The second important American bulwark against authoritarianism that doesn't exist in Georgia is state and local governments. Our federal system is something that really, again, provides defenses. In the police conduct, you see a lot of similarities. The tendency to use masks and not identify violence, aggression, ideological or partisan motivation among some of these agents, which makes them look like a secret police, a political police, a Gestapo, that kind of thing. As far as their conduct, you can get into the details. Generally speaking, the Georgian police at demonstrations do not carry lethal weapons. They don't carry firearms. The RoboCops and the special forces cops do not carry firearms. Pepper spray, tear gas, water cannons, shields, bully clubs, all that, but they don't have guns. So the regular police do have guns, but I give credit to the regular police in Georgia for always being very reluctant to pull guns. I mean, cops in America pull guns because they're afraid everybody else has a gun, but you see, as I'm sure you know from being in other countries, police in other countries, in my experience, and this is true of Georgia, are very, very reluctant to pull their guns. So what you have in Georgia is really aggressive conduct by the police towards demonstrators and beating them up. I would say their tendency towards that physical violence and beating is actually worse than in the U.S. It's even more aggressive. And in the U.S., you can stand in front of an ICE agent and use the worst four-letter words and insult his mother and everything, and it's established in the United States that that's free speech, and he can't touch you for it. Whereas in Georgia, it's actually established legal doctrine that if you insult somebody, they're entitled to punch you in the nose. So that's true. I mean, it's seen as a provocation. It's that kind of society. So if you insult the police, now I maintain that what I said was political speech because I called them Russians, I called them slaves, I called them traitors. Those were political labels. I didn't insult their mothers. I didn't, So it's a bit of give and take. On the one hand, I think your risk of being killed by an American ICE agent is higher than your risk of being killed by a Georgian cop. That's the truth. Your risk of being killed, and we've seen it. Your risk of being beaten up is probably worse by a Georgian cop. But if there was one place where I've noticed the most similarities between Georgia and the United States, it's in the rhetoric of the government and it's in the behavior of the police towards demonstrations. And fortunately, key differences are our courts and our state and local governments, our federalism, that I think have been very important defenses.
One other difference that I would have pointed to in the past is the level of accountability and investigations after incidents of police brutality or killings. Obviously, you did not have any accountability for those who beat you up in Georgia, and I guess we'll see what happens with the victims of violence in Minneapolis. But hopefully there will be accountability there.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, I don't know because I haven't gotten into it, whether victims of violence in Minneapolis, put aside the murder cases for a minute, that the victims of violence in Minneapolis, whether they're pursuing claims in state or federal court. I'm assuming that they're pursuing Section 1983 under the Civil Rights Act. It's essentially unlawful conduct or in violation of constitutional rights by a federal or state officer. Well, states can have equivalent, but by a federal officer.
I think the federal officers are claiming immunity. So we'll see how that plays out.
Oh, well, yeah, right. And you have to distinguish between the civil rights cases, which are the Section 1983 cases, which are personal lawsuits, And there's one immunity doctrine that applies there, and criminal prosecution. Now, it used to be that we didn't have to think about states investigating and prosecuting federal agents because, as you said, you could depend on the FBI and the U.S. attorney to do it. Now you cannot. This, of course, we know, and this is what shocks all of us. And it's me, as I was a law clerk for a federal appellate judge. I saw the standards that U.S. attorneys and the FBI and everybody that they followed, and we've all lived it. That the FBI and the U.S. attorneys and the Justice Department, at least since Watergate, have not been reluctant to investigate and prosecute members of the administration that they serve. But that was nothing but a tradition. That was nothing but an ethic. And Trump has destroyed it completely using the sadly broad constitutional powers, that he can claim to have.
Well, we'll see how things play out there and in the rest of the country as well.
Yeah. So in the case of the murders, the federal government, I mean, these cases are already going cold, aren't they? They're already going stale. I mean, the federal government refused to take any actions against the murderers of Preddy and of Renee Good. And so the states are trying to do something about it. But I mean, I think that for federal agents to get away with that kind of violence against people and not be subject to criminal prosecution is an incredibly dangerous shift in rule of law, or the lack of it in the United States.
I think we're at about time. Are there any parting final comments you wanted to make, Ted? Anything else that you wanted to share with our audience before we sign off?
Yeah, I just would say that I am already active in U.S. politics going into the midterm elections that we're about to have in November 2026 this year. And I'm very focused on restoring democracy and rule of law in the United States because I believe that, especially for countries like Georgia, if we are not a model of democracy and an agent for it, there's very little hope for a place like Georgia. I hate to say that, and Georgians are making their efforts, but I see restoring democracy and rule of law in the United States as extremely important and necessary to reinforcing it elsewhere in the world. And islands of democracy tend to don't last when they're only islands of democracy. We should have learned that in the 20th century. And right now, I see Europe and some of our Asian allies like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan as being the real islands, in some cases literally, islands of democracy. And the U.S. has got to get back in the game. That's our role in the world, and it always has been.
I think that's an excellent note to wind up on. Ted, thank you for taking the time to speak today. Thank you for your candor, and thank you for your work and sacrifice in Georgia and in the United States on behalf of the rule of law and protecting and promoting democracy around the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I enjoyed it.